What were the highlights this past year? That's the question we're asking this week. And for this, we've assembled a panel of Salt and Light producers. Now, a lot of things happened in the church this last year, and not surprisingly, most of them took place in Rome. So that's where we begin. Hopefully some of those images will remind you some of the things that took place this past year. Now, sitting here with me are a few of our Salt and Light TV producers, Kris Dmytrenko.
Hi, Pedro.
Alicia, Ambrosio, and Sebastian, Gomes. Welcome, you guys. So is it unusual, do you think, that most of the things that happened in the church took place in Rome? Is that unusual? I mean, it is Rome, it is the church.
Well, there's a reason they call it Caput Mundi, center of the world.
No, but we've had other years where the bigger events, because there's a World Youth Day or something, that take place outside of Rome.
Well, you consider that a lot of the decisions that are affecting the church on the local level are actually coming from Rome. And so generally, when we have a year where big things are happening outside of Rome, it's usually not positive. It's usually, it's usually a scandal of some sort. It's something that's gone wrong. And so our attention gets pulled there. But in terms of like the decisions that are being made that affect changes in dioceses around the world, that affect different practices and policies, that's all coming from Rome.
Right.
You put this in the bigger picture too. The church is really in a time of reflection. I mean, we're 50 years after Vatican II.
True.
We have this whole effort of the new evangelization that's starting.
Absolutely.
We have the Synod of Bishops, for example, which is one of the main things that happened in Rome. But all these different things are bringing the church to the point where we're saying, we really need to reflect on our own identity as we moved into the new millennium, and where are we going to go forward from here.
That's a good point. So there's almost like you go through a cycle of not looking inward necessarily, but sort of reflecting and then going out. So you mentioned a few things. We saw some of the clips already. What would you say was the biggest news story in the church this year?
For me, I'd say it had to be religious freedom, and that happened on a number of fronts. I'd kind of contest what you're saying about the biggest stories coming out of Rome.
Really,
well, I think that maybe the Middle East might have been certainly a rival for that in terms of Catholic news. And so with the Arab Spring, we saw a number of Christian communities become much more vulnerable. But we also saw religious freedom being a topic here in North America and the United States, with the HHS mandate, mandating that employers provide contraception for their employees, and also even here in Canada, in Ontario, with the gay-straight alliances that the government imposed upon the Catholic schools.
Yeah, okay. Anything else?
Well, I mean, I'm a Vaticanista at heart, and I'm a Vatican nerd. For me,
all roads lead to Rome.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Why wouldn't they? You got a new head of the CDF this year. So that's going to be important because that's going to set the tone for the decisions that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith will make. And one of the big discussions right now or one of the big topics is their discussions with the Society of Pius X. So for me, that's a big thing.
Right, okay.
I think this also points to something else, that it's all about perspective. It's about where you are.
Yes.
Because a lot of the stuff that that Kris mentioned as big news stories didn't resonate across the pond, and a lot of the stuff that were big across the pond just didn't resonate.
No,
here.
and you're right. And a lot of people are not actually paying attention to what happens in Rome because that's not their reality. They're paying attention to what affects them here at home. Do you think, Sebastian?
Well, I go back to the Synod. I mean, I think the Synod was the biggest event, and it took all these things that we're talking about and brought them together. I mean, all of these issues that you guys are mentioned came up among the world's bishops when we were at the Synod for the month of October. Just the experience of the Universal Church was an incredible thing. It doesn't happen often. That's one of the lasting fruits of the Second Vatican Council. We know that Paul VI started the permanent Synod of Bishops to maintain that feeling of fraternity and collaboration with the bishops of the world. But we heard the bishops from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Asia, talking about religious persecution, issues of religious freedom in their countries. We heard the bishops from the United States bring it up as well. So it was really a forum for all these issues to be discussed, and the church really took an MRI of itself and did sort of a self-diagnosis of where we stand in 2012.
Okay, good. So you mentioned the Synod. What would you say was the biggest or most significant church document or papal document or teaching of this year?
Well, I'd have to say Ecclesia in Medio Oriente. So this was the post-synodal apostolic exhortation. So going back to the Synod on the church in the Middle East, the previous Synod. And so this was the Pope's response to that Synod. And I think that the document he released was remarkable for a couple of reasons. One of them was the context of when and how he released it. So he went to Lebanon in a particularly difficult time. Right next door, you've got a war going on in Syria. In the Middle East, there's protests everywhere because of that anti-Muslim film that had just come out. And also the context of the Arab Spring, where Christians were feeling especially vulnerable. But I think that also some of the content of the document made it really remarkable in terms of the Pope saying that both Christians and Muslims can't use religion to justify violence. Basically, he was saying that there are good things about the Arab Spring in terms of democracy and a thirst for freedom, and people characterize it as really a roadmap for the Christians of the Middle East.
Right, okay, good. Alicia, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I agree with Kris, that was big, mainly for a couple of reasons, the context, and we waited 2 years to see this document. And a lot of things changed between the Synod and now. Arab Spring happened in the middle. But for me, two of the documents that came out this year that are perhaps most significant because they reach the widest number of people were probably the message for World Social Communications Day and the message for World Youth Day, because in both of these messages, he gives specific instructions about spreading the word through the new digital means. So he tells priests in his message for World Communications Day, use new media, use digital media to get the word out, to get the gospel out there. And then he tells young people in his message to World Youth Day, engage in the internet. Use the internet to reach your friends. And it's not just talk. It's not just the Pope saying, I want you to do this. 2 weeks later,
the Pope goes
he
on
releases,
Twitter.
He, at Pontifex. And what was phenomenal about that, Claire Diaz-Ortiz of Twitter, she's like the innovation developer at Twitter, and she works with religious leaders who launch Twitter feeds. When they walked into the press conference to announce the Twitter feed, they had 11 followers. So basically
already.
Each person at the Pontifical Council for Social Communication who's responsible for the language, By the end of the press conference, they had 14,000. By the time I checked at the end of the day, at the end of the Roman day, there was 92,000 followers.
Beginning of December, 700,000.
Yeah.
So there you go. Sebastian, what do you think? Most significant document?
Well, as Kris mentioned, after a synod, there is an apostolic exhortation that comes out. That's the document that he was talking about. And we're still waiting for the one to come out on the new evangelization, because the synod just happened in October, right? So we might be waiting, a year or two before Pope Benedict can write and release that. In the meantime, a lot of people don't know this, after the ordinary synods, when the bishops come to Rome to gather, they issue sort of a pastoral letter. And this year, at the end of October, it was called The Message to the People of God. And it was like, okay, we bishops have been here. You've been wondering why we're away from our sees for 3 weeks. We've been talking about all these issues in the context of the new evangelization. Here's what we've been talking about, and here's what we want you to know. And it's an incredible letter. It's available online, but not a lot of people know about it. And it focuses the new evangelization on a renewed encounter with Christ, and the bishops say, we're the first ones who need that. So it was very self-reflective.
Okay, good. So I think most people are not reading papal documents or teaching. So there you go, some suggestions. Just before we end the first half, what would you say was maybe the best TV moment for the church?
Oh, that has to be the Pope's trip to Mexico.
Okay,
everywhere he went, the Marianitas serenading him. But I think the best moment was one that we didn't actually have a live feed for. I saw it later on YouTube, where the locals basically went to the Nunciatura and stood outside his window singing, Canta y no llores. And he finally came out, and they presented him with this beautiful white sombrero that he actually put on his head, and Georg didn't take it away. And he just looked so radiant and so happy. That would be it.
Everybody needs to go to Mexico. What do you think? Do you think that that photo is probably the photo of the year? But best TV moments?
The best TV moment for me was the witness interview that Father Tom did with Archbishop, now Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle.
Yes.
And Kris, you and I were actually there when that interview took place, because it was in Dublin.
Yeah.
We were there for the Eucharistic Congress. It's a magnificent interview. It helped put him on the map, so to speak, that people had an interview now to sort of say, who is this guy? Because he really blew up over the last year. And now, announced during the Synod that the Pope was going to create 6 new cardinals, and he was one of them, and very, very young. I mean, only in his late 50s. So the second youngest cardinal now among the entire college. So that interview was very powerful experience to be there. He's a wonderfully inspiring and holy person.
He is.
But just because of sort of how he's catapulted onto the world scene, I think that was a very significant moment for
Good, yeah. So if you've never heard about Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, check him out. Kris, do you agree? Do you have something else?
I would say it was the Pope meeting Fidel Castro. We didn't know that was going to happen. And it was a really they really had an interesting conversation. We heard about it afterwards. They talked about them both being, fairly old in their experience
Same
of that.
age, yeah.
And also it was an interesting window into the religious worldview of Fidel Castro, and apparently he had many questions about the liturgy, and he asked Pope Benedict to send him a number of books about the questions that he had. And so it was definitely a different side of Fidel.
That's great. We should find out if the Holy Father actually sent him those books. That would
And
be
what
good.
books he sent.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we're going to take a little break here right now. We're talking about highlights of 2012, and when we come back, we're going to continue. And in particular, we're going to look at some of our Holy Father's trips. So don't go anywhere.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail. Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1. Or call us toll free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
There we have some more images of this past year, again, hopefully bringing some memories back. A lot of things happen in the world also, and some of these things obviously affect the church. So what would you say was the biggest secular story that affected the church? Kris?
For me, I'd say it was the war in Syria that's still ongoing. And the Christians of Syria, many of them are very supportive of the regime because they look at what's happening next door in other countries where regimes have been toppled and suddenly the Christians no longer have any protection.
Right.
And so it puts the church in really an impossible situation because they don't want to leave the Syrian Christians stranded and suddenly under a new regime that doesn't offer them any protection or actively persecutes them. And at the same time, they can't be seen as supporting a totalitarian regime that has been attacking civilians. And so this coincides with the church trying to discern how to help the Christians of the Middle East.
Yeah, okay. Alicia?
Kris mentioned before the HHS mandate, and I think that really highlighted how does the church interact with a government in a country where church and state are supposed to be separated. But also very quickly, in Ireland, there was a case where a Hindu woman, was miscarrying, and they wouldn't perform an abortion even though they knew she was losing the child, and she ended up dying. And so now that affects the church in that now the bishops of Ireland are really being called on to defend the church's pro-life statement and Ireland's anti-abortion stance. How do you do that when now you have a face that people can put to the cause, you know, to their cause of this is why they want abortion to be legal in Ireland. So I think that's a big one that was potentially underreported on the North American side.
True, absolutely. Sebastian?
Yeah, I think what Alicia said about the HHS mandate is probably what I would say, just because of the proximity with us to the United States. And it really opened up this question about religious liberty, and it's all context, right? Remember, we're talking about the new evangelization. We're talking about a Western world that is becoming more secularized, and those influences are sort of pushing on, you know, they're at our doorstep, kind of thing, you know. So these are serious questions that we need to be asking ourselves. But it's very, very important to think long and hard about the way we want to move forward with this as a church, because the risk is that we become politicized, that we become too much associated with this party or this issue, and that's never the role of the church. That's clear in all the teachings of the church. So we have to find a way of being above all that, but also maintaining our own freedoms, obviously, and the role that we have to play in a society that's changing so quickly.
So none of you think that the Pope's butler was a secular story that affected the church? No, I'm serious, because I mean we laugh because it's
I have that on my list, actually.
Yeah,
I had that on my list.
It's significant.
No, it is. It's huge. And it's huge that it's not just the butler, but there was an IT guy in the Secretariat of State who was implicated. And there was, you know, whispers about who else, about potential cardinals, potential monsignors involved. And I wouldn't call that so much a secular story. I think it was highly reported in the secular press because it was a scandal. But it speaks to the fact that, yeah, Rome, the Vatican, it's the center of the church, but nobody ever said it's perfect.
Well, I hope that the Vatileaks affair finally puts to death the myth that the Vatican is shrouded in secrecy. They've actually been terrible at keeping secrets for a very long time, and now everyone knows it.
And many people on the inside would say it's not so much that they're secretive, they're just disorganized.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Sebastian earlier mentioned that it was almost like 2012 was a year where the church looks inward. So let's do a little bit of inward looking, and what would you say was the most significant moment, either for you personally or for Salt and Light?
I would answer both those questions in the same way. The Synod, I mean, I was at the Synod as a correspondent
for a whole month,
for us here at Salt and Light. We were doing a number of interviews with different cardinals and bishops and delegates, and really trying to tell the story of what was going on the inside. It was very significant for Salt and Light because we were the only outside media outlet that was granted access. There was a few Vatican news agencies that were in there as well. Father Tom was in there because he was appointed by the Pope as the English language secretary, so him and 4 others who were representing the 5 official languages were there, and then Charles and I.
So, and when you say access, you mean literally inside the Synod hall?
Literally inside, watching the discussions, watching the debates among the bishops. You know, the Pope was there many of the days. So that was very significant for us. The other thing that happened while we were at the Synod, one of the days, was we released In Her Footsteps, and we had the world premiere at St. John Lateran.
So this is the documentary on St. Kateri.
Exactly, the documentary that we produced on St. Kateri. And it was a magnificent evening. We had a prayer vigil that was presided over by Cardinal Ouellette after we showed the film. There were 2,000 pilgrims there, mostly from Canada and the United States, a number of representatives from the First Nations, and
people that were actually in the documentary, the Fink Bonner family.
The Fink Bonner family, Jacob, the miracle boy,
Sister Kateri Mitchell,
Sister Kateri. It was a wonderful, wonderful event. And to do it at St. John Lateran, I mean, it's such an incredible venue.
That's a great, moving experience.
It was very, very moving.
Good, Kris.
I think for me personally, the most significant moment would have been finally the release of our documentary Across the Divide about the Christian University students of the Holy Land, because I've been working on that for so long.
Yes.
So finally to bring that to an audience was
several audiences.
Several audiences.
Yes.
We had 4 screenings across the country. Was wonderful to see, and to finally see how people would respond to it. But also, I'd say traveling to Niger, so an upcoming production that we're going to be doing in partnership with Development and Peace and the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And so finally getting to see how the church works in a very, very different context than anything I've experienced to help alleviate a food crisis. So that was powerful for me.
Good experience for you. And I mean, we've mentioned 2 of the documentaries, Across the Divide and In Her Footsteps. If you haven't seen them or heard about them, visit our website and check them out. Just briefly, because we are almost out of time, any predictions for 2013?
The one that comes to mind, I don't know if it's what you're looking for, but the findings on the apparitions in Medjugorje.
In Medjugorje, absolutely.
At the beginning of 2012, it was announced that the Commission would release their findings by the end of 2012.
So we expect this to be coming down the pipe.
It hasn't happened, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen before the end of 2012. So 2013, like they've got to make a decision.
Okay. Any other thoughts on predictions?
I'm anxious to see if the Apostolic Exhortation on the Synod on the New Evangelization comes out this year. It usually takes a little bit longer than a year, up to 2 years, as we saw with the one after the Synod in the Middle East. It'd be very interesting, though, because the New Evangelization is something that's happening now. It has to happen now and get going. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what the Pope does with the proposition.
Kris, any thoughts?
Well, I think that against all odds, World Youth Day in Rio will be a success.
I like it.
We wonder about the logistics. We look back on World Youth Day in Spain, and there were many, many problems. But I think that World Youth Day Rio will come together, and they'll make it work.
Good. I'm with you on that. It always is. Anyway, we're going to wrap up our conversation by reflecting on the Word of God. We always leave the last word to the one who is the Word. So this is from the first letter of St. John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Beloved, we declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. This life was revealed, and we have seen it and testified to it, and declare to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. So that's from the first letter of John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Sebastian, would you like to share something brief?
The thing that strikes me from this passage, and it's very much connected with the Gospel of John itself, the purpose of the Gospel was, John says at the end, so that you might believe in Jesus and have life in His name or in Him. And there's a continuation of that, except there's this small nuance in fellowship with us, right? So that the idea is that the relationship or the encounter with Christ also happens within the community. It's not just something personal. And you get a sense of, this is the Catholic tradition, that it's something that we're handing on, and it's something that's life-giving. And I think at this important time in the Church, we're celebrating the anniversary of the Council. We're doing, this MRI on our identity and our role in the modern world. It's important to remember that we're handing things on. We're doing new things. We're a life-giving community. We're not preaching a dead Christ. So it's a call, I think, to no longer be afraid, but also have a lot of hope in the context of community.
Good. Thank you, Alicia.
What he said. Yeah, it speaks to me of continuity. Like we are proclaiming what was, what is now, and what will be. So that it's a reminder that the message doesn't change. Hold fast to the message, but follow that message and have the experience that becomes the message. And it means we have to find new ways of transmitting that message, of drawing people into experience, but at its core, it's the same.
Thank you. Kris?
For me, it's a reminder that it's all truly about Jesus. And I think there can be so many distractions. There were a lot of distractions, like if we think of the VatiLeaks scandal this year. But that's not really who the Church is. That's not our identity. And so we have to go back to the gospel, and that has to be our mission.
Well, thank you very much. Those are wise words and a great scripture passage to begin the new year, this year of faith. We've been talking about highlights of 2012 with our Salt and Light producers, Kris Dmytrenko, Alicia, Ambrosio, and Sebastian Gomes. Thanks, guys, for your perspectives. And now it's your turn. We want to hear your perspective. What do you think was the highlight of 2012? Write to us on Facebook. Have a blessed new year, and may God continue blessing you this Christmas season.